They called it the pinnacle of modern manufacturing, a $500 million automated assembly line designed to craft heritage products until a little girl simply whispered, "It's screaming." While her mother scrubs the oil-stained floors of the century-old factory, 11-year-old Hannah waits in the shadows, listening to mechanical rhythms and filling her leather-bound journal with notes on tension. No one sees her. But when the company's brand-new robotic system violently jams and begins destroying priceless materials, panic spreads. Software engineers scramble, executives argue over bleeding profits, and the CEO demands answers. All the while, a harsh grinding sound, echoing beneath the factory alarms, catches Hannah's ear, a cry too subtle for coding experts, but unmistakable to a child raised on the songs of old gears. What could a maid's daughter possibly know about the agonizing pain of a $500 million machine? Before we reveal her secret, drop a comment telling me what time it is and what city you are watching from right now to show me how far this story has traveled. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our daily videos. Now let us jump right back in. The factory floor of Dalton Heritage Instruments reeked of burning metal and shattered mahogany. The Maestro system was tearing itself apart. The massive robotic arms designed to delicately string grand pianos were moving with terrifying erratic jerks, snapping high carbon steel wires like fragile threads. Pieces of precious wood splintered outward, showering the concrete floor with debris. Standing behind the reinforced safety glass of the main control booth, Dr. Simon Carter, the lead software engineer, hammered his fingers across a glowing console. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he ran diagnostic after diagnostic, trying to force an emergency reboot. Error codes flashed in rapid succession, casting a harsh red light over his pale face. He punched the kill command into the terminal, but the central processing unit rejected the override. The mechanical leviathan ignored the software completely. It tightened a heavy vice grip around a freshly polished soundboard, applying immense pressure until a deafening crack echoed through the cavernous space. CEO Gregory Dalton watched the destruction unfold from the catwalk, above, gripping the metal railing so hard his knuckles turned white. His perfectly tailored suit felt suffocatingly tight as he witnessed his $500 million investment systematically dismantling a century of company legacy. Every ruined frame represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue, and the financial bleeding was accelerating by the second. He shouted orders into his radio, demanding an immediate manual shutdown, but the floor supervisors were completely paralyzed by the sheer violence of the malfunctioning machinery. Down on the ground level, the situation was becoming increasingly perilous. Brenda, a dedicated cleaner, who spent her days polishing oil stains from these very floors, dropped her mop in pure terror. Sparks showered down from a severed overhead cable, landing dangerously close to the viewing perimeter. She spun around, scanning the chaotic environment until her eyes locked onto her daughter. Hannah stood dangerously close to the outer safety railing, clutching her leather-bound journal tightly against her chest. Her blue eyes were wide open, not with fear, but with an intense, unsettling focus on the screeching gears. Brenda sprinted across the slippery floor, her heart pounding relentlessly against her ribs. She grabbed the little girl by the shoulder, pulling her forcefully back toward the shadows of the loading bay. She scolded her daughter in a hushed, frantic voice, warning her about the flying shrapnel and the unpredictable swings of the robotic limbs. Hannah did not resist the physical pull, but her gaze remained firmly fixed on the mechanical disaster unfolding before them. She tilted her head slightly, listening intently to the agonizing metallic groans that pierced through the wailing factory alarms. While the highly paid experts stared helplessly at their frozen computer screens, desperately searching for a software glitch, the young girl focused entirely on the physical vibration of the room. The deafening noise was sheer chaos to everyone else, but to her highly sensitive ears, it carried a very specific rhythm. Dr. Carter finally slammed his fist against the desk in total frustration, screaming that the mainframe was locked in a localized feedback loop and completely unresponsive to external commands. He barked furiously at the remaining engineering staff, demanding alternative analog solutions, while the gigantic iron claws above them swung wildly out of their designated operational zones. The tension in the room reached an absolute boiling point as the rogue machinery prepared to clamp down on yet another priceless instrument. Gregory Dalton rushed down the metal staircase, his mind racing through disastrous scenarios of bankruptcy and ruined professional reputations. The corporate dream of flawless automated precision had rapidly dissolved into a horrifying nightmare of uncontrollable mechanical force, leaving the brightest technological minds in the building utterly powerless to stop the ongoing carnage. Stepping out from the glass elevator, Director Richard Cobb ignored the warning sirens entirely. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the industrial grid floor as he marched directly toward the primary command station. Cobb was a man who lived and died by quarterly projections, and the current mechanical disaster was threatening his upcoming presentation to the aggressive New York Investment Board. He shoved his way past a group of terrified junior technicians and confronted Dr. Carter, who was still frantically typing on the locked terminal. Cobb slammed his hand flat onto the main console, demanding an immediate explanation for the halted production line. Carter barely looked up from the glowing screens, explaining that the Maestro system was experiencing a critical physical desynchronization and that engaging the robotic arms any further would result in complete structural failure. Cobb sneered at the technical jargon, completely dismissing the brilliant engineer's assessment. The ruthless director pointed a sharp finger at the sprawling assembly floor where half-finished premium pianos lay in ruins and ordered Carter to initiate a forced manual override. The software engineer froze, turning around to face the executive with absolute disbelief. He explicitly warned Cobb that bypassing the factory safety limiters would push the high-torque servo motors far beyond their maximum thermal capacity. Carter stressed that forcing the heavy mechanical limbs to operate without sensor guidance would cause the highly pressurized hydraulic lines to rupture violently, sending lethal metal shrapnel directly into the lower working areas where the cleaning staff and junior mechanics were currently taking cover. The danger was not a mere hypothetical software simulation, but an imminent physical reality that could result in severe human casualties. CEO Gregory Dalton stood nearby, listening to the fierce verbal exchange with a pale face deeply torn between the terrifying financial hemorrhage and the horrific potential for a fatal workplace accident. Cobb, however, remained completely unfazed by the desperate safety warnings. He leaned closer to Carter, lowering his voice into a vicious, threatening growl. The director made it absolutely clear that the international export deadline was tomorrow morning, and the wealthy shareholders did not care about hydraulic pressure or automated safety protocols. They only cared about quarterly delivery numbers and pristine profit margins. Cobb demanded that the digital safety mode be permanently disabled and the robotic production sequence be restarted using raw manual inputs, regardless of the immense stress accumulating within the machinery. When Carter hesitated, citing strict federal workplace safety regulations and his own ethical responsibilities as an engineer, Cobb unleashed his ultimate weapon. He coldly threatened to terminate Carter and every single member of the software development team on the spot, effectively blacklisting them from the American technology industry forever. The arrogant director declared that if Carter refused to flip the master override switch, he would find someone else in the building who would, even if it meant executing the dangerous command himself. The sheer corporate greed of the executive created a suffocating atmosphere inside the control booth, completely ignoring the agonizing sounds of the trapped machinery echoing outside. Cobb reached his hand aggressively toward the restricted analog control panel, fully intending to force the crippled system back into motion. The lives of the vulnerable laborers down on the factory floor meant absolutely nothing to a man entirely obsessed with maintaining his flawless financial reputation. Carter stood his ground, blocking the critical panel with his own body, while Dalton remained paralyzed by the sheer weight of the impending disaster. The fierce human conflict within the protective glass booth perfectly mirrored the violent mechanical tension of the massive robotic arms waiting just outside the windows, ready to snap under the immense pressure of a deadly corporate mandate. Hiding behind a stack of rejected soundboards, Hannah traced a sharp line across her journal. Her graphite pencil dug deeply into the thick paper, capturing the precise angle of the mechanical stress she was observing. She blocked out the shouting executives and the wailing sirens, completely focusing her mind entirely on the pure physical reality of the catastrophic failure happening mere yards away. The screeching metal and the explosive snapping of the premium mahogany were not random sounds of a broken machine, but a desperate physical language expressing unbearable strain. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the chaotic industrial noise wash over her as she recalled the quiet lessons of old Artie Jenkins. Artie was a retired blind piano tuner who had spent 50 dedicated years working in this exact factory before the massive automated assembly line finally replaced him. He used to let Hannah sit silently beside him on the quiet weekend shifts, teaching her how to listen carefully to the invisible soul of the raw materials. He constantly reminded her that organic wood was never truly dead because it continued to breathe and react dynamically to the surrounding atmosphere long after being cut from the forest. Artie taught her that the dense mahogany sourced specifically for the Dalton Heritage instruments was exceptionally sensitive to the unpredictable weather patterns sweeping off the freezing eastern seaboard. Hannah opened her eyes and looked down at her frantic pencil calculations, noting the drastic environmental shift that had occurred overnight. A severe unseasonal cold front had unexpectedly hit the city, plummeting the internal factory temperature and stripping absolutely all the natural humidity from the circulating indoor air. The extreme dry chill caused the microscopic cellular structure of the wooden instrument frames to contract severely, shrinking the material tightly into a dangerously rigid, brittle state. The $500 million Maestro system, however, was blindly following a strict, inflexible, digital schedule. The central factory database was currently running the standard summer calibration parameters, which falsely assumed the wood was slightly swollen and flexible from the heavy seasonal coastal humidity. The flawless software was instructing the gigantic iron claws to apply massive summer-level rotational torque to the dangerously tight winter wood. There was absolutely no glitch in the programming code itself. The highly advanced computer system was simply deaf to the changing seasons and entirely blind to the fundamental laws of everyday physics playing out on the factory floor. Hannah rapidly scribbled another complex mathematical formula across the page, accurately calculating the maximum tensile strength of both the wooden soundboards and the heavy robotic steel joints. The horrifying truth quickly materialized on the paper before her in stark, dark graphite strokes. The extreme physical resistance from the contracted wood was currently fighting violently against the relentless hydraulic pressure of the robotic servos, creating a massive kinetic energy buildup deep within the main machine core. If Director Cobb actually succeeded in bypassing the factory safety protocols and forced the automated arms to push through the intense resistance for even one more mechanical cycle, the resulting violent kickback would be absolutely devastating. The immense trapped kinetic tension would not merely crush the remaining expensive pianos, but would instantly snap the primary solid titanium axis of the central robotic unit. A structural failure of that massive physical magnitude would send heavy lethal metal shrapnel tearing directly through the entire glass control booth and the lower crowded assembly floor. Hannah realized with absolute terrifying certainty that the arrogant director was literally seconds away from triggering a deadly mechanical explosion just to protect his fabricated quarterly financial report. She snapped her leather-bound journal shut, gripping the worn cover with trembling cold fingers as the sheer crushing gravity of the undeniable physical truth settled heavily onto her small shoulders. Her worn sneakers slapped against the concrete as she sprinted toward the main control podium. She darted past the towering stacks of raw lumber and slipped underneath the heavy yellow caution tape, completely ignoring her mother, calling out frantically from the loading bay. The massive glass doors of the elevated command booth were sliding open as a few terrified junior technicians rushed out, trying to escape the impending mechanical explosion. Hannah pushed her way against the fleeing crowd, forcing her small frame through the narrow opening, just as the heavy glass panels slammed shut behind her. The noise inside the enclosed space was slightly muffled, but the electric tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Director Richard Cobb was already lunging forcefully toward the restricted analog panel. His right hand stretched out with rigid determination to yank the heavy red master override lever downward. Hannah did not hesitate for a single second. She threw herself directly into his path, slamming her small back hard against the cold steel of the primary console and gripping the edges of the metal panel with both of her hands. She effectively shielded the critical lever with her own fragile body, just inches away from the furious executive. Cobb stumbled backward, momentarily, completely shocked by the sudden physical obstruction blocking his ultimate authority. His expensive leather briefcase dropped to the floor, scattering confidential financial documents everywhere across the pristine tiles. The initial surprise quickly morphed into an ugly dark rage as he recognized the ragged clothes and smudged face of the young girl. He towered over her, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he unleashed a vicious tirade of degrading insults. He aggressively demanded to know exactly what an ignorant cleaner's child was doing inside a restricted high-security zone, currently managing a massive $500 million crisis. His voice cracked with sheer aggressive panic as he spun around, demanding the immediate presence of armed factory guards to physically drag the trespassing girl out of the building. He threatened to have both her and her mother permanently banned from the premises and relentlessly prosecuted for severe industrial sabotage. Two security officers immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, reaching for their heavy tactical belts. Hannah, however, did not flinch or cower beneath the imposing shadow of the ruthless director. She completely turned out his aggressive screaming, refusing to even acknowledge his towering existence or the rapidly approaching guards. Instead, she turned her head slightly and locked her sharp blue eyes directly onto CEO Gregory Dalton. The young corporate leader was still standing frozen near the observation window, trapped in a state of sheer, overwhelming panic as his entire company legacy crumbled around him. He expected to see sheer terror in the eyes of the young intruder, but instead he found an absolute piercing calmness that completely defied the incredibly chaotic environment. The deafening screech of the tortured robotic joints outside provided a horrifying backdrop to the sudden, unnatural standoff happening inside the isolated booth. The heavy security guards reached out to grab her small shoulders, but Dalton instinctively raised a trembling hand, ordering them to halt immediately. Something in the absolute, unwavering certainty of the young girl demanded his immediate attention, overriding his basic corporate instincts. Hannah took a deep breath, steadying her racing heart before she finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the frantic shouting with absolute crystalline clarity. She looked straight into Dalton's desperate eyes and delivered the cold, undeniable truth. "The machine is not malfunctioning, sir. It is screaming because you are forcing it to speak the wrong language." The heavy silence that followed her words was abruptly pierced by the ringing of solid steel. Hannah reached deep into her faded denim pocket and pulled out a tarnished metal tuning fork. She completely ignored Dr. Simon Carter, who was still frantically tapping on his glowing keyboard, trying to decipher endless strings of useless error codes. She turned her back on the furious executive and walked purposefully toward the shattered opening of the control booth, directly approaching the nearest frozen robotic arm. The massive iron claw was currently clutching a beautiful mahogany soundboard in a terrifyingly tight grip, waiting for the final lethal command to push forward. CEO Gregory Dalton watched in absolute mesmerized silence as the young girl confidently stepped into the highly dangerous operational zone, ignoring the strict industrial safety protocols. She raised the heavy steel tuning fork and struck it sharply against the heavy metal railing, sending a pure, piercing, vibrating hum through the chilled factory air. Without a single moment of hesitation, she pressed the rounded base of the vibrating instrument directly against the heavily pressurized wooden piano frame. The resulting sound was absolutely horrifying to anyone who truly understood acoustics. Instead of the warm, rich, resonant acoustic tone that the premium heritage instruments were globally famous for, the wood emitted a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. It was a tight, distorted mechanical squeal that vibrated with immense, unnatural stress, physically assaulting the ears of everyone standing nearby. Hannah looked up at the towering CEO holding the vibrating steel firmly against the struggling material. She explained loudly over the factory alarms that the sudden winter air had completely drained the natural moisture from the timber, causing the cellular structure to shrink and harden dramatically overnight. She told Dalton to listen closely to the terrible, unnatural pitch, completely proving that the physical tension was already at a critical breaking point. The automated sensors were blindly expecting the softer, lower acoustic frequency of expanded summer wood, but the cold, hard reality was singing a completely different song. She struck the tuning fork a second time, placing it against a different section of the clamped mahogany, demonstrating the exact same terrifying acoustic distortion. Dalton took a slow, hesitant step forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the shattered wooden debris littering the concrete floor. He leaned in closer to the trapped instrument and finally heard the undeniable physical truth that no digital spreadsheet or software diagnostic could ever possibly capture. The premium wood was literally screaming under the immense, inappropriate pressure, precisely as the young girl had bravely claimed. He looked from the simple vibrating metal tool in her small hand to the multi-million-dollar computer screens flashing uselessly inside the command center. The profound contrast between the ancient acoustic technique and the failing modern robotics was absolutely staggering. A massive $500 million technological marvel was on the verge of total catastrophic destruction simply because it lacked the basic human ability to feel and listen to the physical world. The brilliant software engineers had programmed flawless mathematical routines, but they had completely forgotten to teach the machine how to adapt to the unpredictable organic nature of their core materials. The high-frequency screech echoing from the soundboard, perfectly validated every single word Hannah had spoken, shattering the arrogant corporate illusion of absolute digital control. Dalton stared at the desperately strained mahogany, realizing with a sudden, sickening clarity that forcing the heavy servo motors to complete their programmed cycle would instantly snap the main core axis, causing an irreversible industrial disaster. The undeniable physical proof vibrated right through his chest, completely overriding his previous financial panic and awakening a deep, profound understanding of the delicate, traditional craftsmanship his historic company was originally supposed to represent. Richard Cobb lunged forward to grab the girl's shoulder, his patience completely exhausted. He intended to violently shove her aside and force the master override lever himself, regardless of the catastrophic consequences. Before his heavy hand could make contact, CEO Gregory Dalton stepped sharply into his path. Dalton slammed his own forearm against the director's wrist, knocking it away with a fierce physical force that shocked everyone in the immediate vicinity. The time for passive observation was permanently over. Dalton stared into Cobb's furious eyes, suddenly seeing the absolute toxic greed festering beneath the tailored suit. The ruthless executive was entirely willing to shatter a century of historic craftsmanship and risk fatal injuries just to inflate a single quarterly earnings report. Dalton realized with absolute clarity that allowing this reckless management style to continue would ultimately destroy the very foundation of Dalton Heritage Instruments. He squared his shoulders, radiating a newfound imposing authority that instantly silenced the panicked chatter of the surrounding technicians. Dalton's voice cut through the blaring mechanical alarms like a steel blade. He loudly declared that Director Richard Cobb was officially suspended from all corporate duties, effective immediately pending a full board investigation. He ordered the disgraced executive to surrender his security clearance badge and evacuate the production floor without speaking another word. Cobb stood absolutely paralyzed by the brutal public humiliation, his face draining of all color, as the sheer reality of his sudden professional downfall crushed his arrogant ego. He looked around expecting the other senior managers to defend his aggressive tactics, but they all quickly averted their eyes, completely abandoning him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the uncompromising glare from the company leader immediately silenced him. The nearby security personnel who had previously been summoned to remove the young girl now stepped forward to confidently escort the humiliated director out of the restricted building. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind him, permanently sealing his fate. With the toxic disruption finally removed, Dalton turned his full attention back to the immediate industrial crisis threatening the factory. He looked down at Hannah, treating her no longer as a trespassing cleaner's child, but as the only individual who truly understood the physical reality of their failing machinery. Dalton gestured toward the main command console and firmly instructed Dr. Simon Carter to immediately unlock the manual calibration override screens. The lead software engineer frantically cleared the flashing red error codes, bringing up the raw mechanical input fields for the heavy robotic servos. Dalton knelt slightly, bringing his eye level down to meet Hannah's incredibly steady gaze. He respectfully asked the young girl what physical tension parameters they needed to input to save the remaining uncrushed mahogany piano frames. Hannah did not display any nervous hesitation despite the immense corporate pressure weighing heavily on her small shoulders. She spoke clearly, instructing Dr. Carter to reduce the primary hydraulic torque output by 40% to safely compensate for the brittle winter wood. She then told the sweating engineer to entirely recalibrate the automated grip sensitivity sensors to accommodate a significantly narrower organic density curve. She meticulously explained that the rigid timber required a much slower rotational speed, preventing the iron claws from snapping the delicate internal acoustic ribs. Carter's shaking fingers flew rapidly across the glowing keyboard, typing the precise physical offsets the young girl dictated directly into the system's core operational registry. Dalton stood closely beside them, intently watching the complex digital numbers finally aligning perfectly with the harsh organic truth of the freezing factory environment. The survival of the $500 million robotic manufacturing system now rested entirely on the brilliant calculations of a fearless young girl guiding the most advanced industrial software in the world. The first adjusted rotation of the robotic arm moved with a silent, terrifying precision. The heavy iron claw descended toward the fragile mahogany frame, applying the newly calculated physical pressure. The entire factory floor held its collective breath, anticipating another agonizing crack of shattered timber, but the massive machine simply hummed a low, steady rhythm. The robotic joints locked into place, perfectly gripping the severely contracted winter wood without causing a single microscopic fracture. The Maestro system smoothly resumed its highly complex automated sequence, stringing the high carbon steel wires with absolute flawless acoustic grace. The horrifying industrial nightmare was officially over, replaced by the soothing mechanical harmony of true manufacturing precision. Outside the towering glass windows of the main production facility, the disgraced former executive faced a drastically different reality. Two burly corporate security guards escorted Richard Cobb aggressively through the rain-slicked parking lot, shoving him unceremoniously into the back of a waiting security vehicle. His expensive tailored suit was completely soaked, and his arrogant demeanor had completely vanished under the crushing weight of his imminent professional ruin. The corporate board of directors had already been fully notified of his reckless behavior, triggering an immediate, devastating internal financial audit. Worse still, anonymous whistleblower reports regarding his highly dangerous attempts to bypass critical federal workplace safety regulations for personal financial gain were simultaneously forwarded directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Cobb was no longer a powerful, untouchable industry titan, but a desperate criminal suspect facing years of severe legal prosecution and complete financial bankruptcy. Back inside the stabilized production warehouse, CEO Gregory Dalton slowly descended the metal staircase, completely ignoring the cheering junior technicians celebrating the miraculous system recovery. He walked directly toward the shadowy loading bay, where a frantic mother was currently hugging her incredibly brave daughter. Brenda looked up with sheer, unadulterated terror, expecting to be immediately fired and prosecuted for the massive security breach. But the powerful corporate leader simply offered a deep, highly respectful bow. Dalton publicly apologized for the toxic arrogance of his management team, openly acknowledging that their blind obsession with digital data had nearly destroyed the entire century-old company legacy. He officially promoted Brenda on the spot, elevating her from a minimum wage cleaner to the prestigious permanent role of head facility coordinator, with a full executive salary and complete corporate health benefits. He then knelt respectfully before Hannah pulled out a pristine, gold-embossed company card. He firmly promised the young girl a fully funded, unlimited educational trust, guaranteeing her absolute free access to the finest engineering universities in the entire country whenever she was ultimately ready to attend. He desperately wanted her brilliant, intuitive mind permanently aligned with the future development of Dalton Heritage Instruments. The chaotic day finally settled into a peaceful, highly productive evening as the massive factory machines continued operating flawlessly in the quiet background. Hannah stood quietly near the restored assembly line, watching the gleaming robotic arms dance perfectly in sync with the cold natural atmosphere. She gently closed her worn leather-bound journal, completely satisfied with the profound physical truth she had successfully defended against overwhelming corporate odds. She looked up at the towering steel contraption and delivered her final undeniable conclusion to the silent surrounding executives. She stated clearly that it absolutely does not matter if a massive global corporation spends $500 million on the most sophisticated industrial artificial intelligence ever created. If that brilliant, expensive technology fundamentally lacks the basic human capacity to truly listen and empathetically adapt to the harsh organic realities of the physical world, it will forever remain nothing more than a dangerous, towering monument of deaf, soulless iron.